Welcome to Avant-garde Entrepreneur. I am so glad you're here today with me, my friend. I'm starting us off with a quote. You are an entrepreneur because you can't be anything else. You can't live as a cog in someone else's dream. You're willing to suffer the trials, tribulations, and traumas of entrepreneurship so that you can build your own. How true is that? Today, I am excited to introduce you to Alexander Concepcion, the man behind the quote that so many of us identify with. Alexander is the owner of Taco Street Locating and the author of a new book called Survival First, The Rebel Entrepreneur's Guide to Risk, Riches, and Immortality. Like some of you, Alexander started his business and was really just hitting his stride before the COVID-induced lockdowns started happening. And also like you, he just kept going. And he did a lot of soul searching and introspective self-educating along the way. And like you, I talk about this a lot. Like you, he found that the answers to these burning questions that he had, they were not in books. So he essentially went on an expedition inside himself, asking himself simple but difficult questions about what was working and what was not, what were his risks and his opportunities, and even what do these words actually mean? Was there a way to reframe them so that they could serve him instead of holding him hostage? The results changed his outlook, his business and his life, and thankfully, he's sharing it with us in his book. Reading Alexander's book, I laughed out loud. I have to tell you, I'm going to admit, I even snorted a few times because I was laughing so hard. The stories are just incredible. And I read somewhere that if you're laughing, you're learning. So even though the word risk isn't something we think of laughing at, Alexander has a new way for us to think about it. And if you tune in to what he shares, I'm certain it will change your social enterprise and your life for the better. Alexander, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. That's the coolest intro anyone has given me. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah.
You've got a cool background, so we really appreciate you being on the show to share. So tell us about yourself, Alexander. I talked a little bit more about, kind of my perspective from what I've seen from the book, but tell us about where you grew up. Did you go to college? We talk a lot about that a lot of people who are super successful don't go to college. What was your early career like?
Yeah. So I grew up in Miami, Florida, to Cuban American immigrants. And my dad is a lawyer. My mom likes to think of herself as a domestic engineer, played a big supporting role in raising us. And I went to college at Penn State. And after Penn State, I graduated with degrees in finance and economics, thinking that's what smart people do. And it's prestigious degrees at a prestigious business schools. And then I'm going to get a prestigious job at a prestigious company, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward 2 years after college, I'm still living at home with my parents, broke. And I could blame the degrees and college and all that stuff. Classic self-sabotage in the sense that something unconscious inside me was like, this isn't the path. Like, whatever you're doing right now is not what you're supposed to be doing. Do something else. I did the logical thing, which was burn my diplomas and move to Austin, Texas, a city I've never been to before. And I started off from scratch, effectively, as if I never went to college. I jokingly refer to myself as a post-grad dropout. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time just aimlessly stumbling around from job to side gig. And eventually, because I was broke and desperate and had a real estate license, I started doing this real estate niche called apartment locating. And I didn't plan on doing that for long. I thought it was just a quick stepping stone to like a salary. Then I started making money fast, like good money. I'm like, whoa, this is cool. And I turned that into my own company, Taco Street Locating. And I'm like, oh, wow, I get to do whatever I want. I could travel when I want. I get to wake up when I want and work on what I want. And I kind of just stumbled into this life of sovereignty and freedom and autonomy that I never thought was possible for me. When the pandemic began, like everyone else, I was like, uh-oh, this is terrifying. All of my clients are gone. If this continues on, I don't know what's going to happen, but I might have to get a job and lose all of this freedom that I fought for. Mm-hmm. I'm like, no, it's not. I'm not going to do that. And luckily, the pandemic wound up being a blessing for my business because people from all over the country were moving to Texas. And that's my business, is helping people relocate. So 2020 and 2021 were by far my best years. And I just wanted to understand, why do businesses die? Because I'm in the minority here in the sense that I'm alive, I'm making it, and you get to hear my story. But for most people, you don't hear their story because they don't survive long enough to tell it. And for me to understand what is survival, I had to go into just the basics, like what's risk? What would make me not survive? And then that became this almost 4-year rabbit hole to create this book that I've created to attempt to answer that question. Because all this is a quest for sovereignty and survival and autonomy. So I get to continue to live on my terms and do what I want to do and have the ability / burden to make my own decisions. So yeah, hopefully that was comprehensive.
Yeah, that was. One thing I do, because we have such an international audience, this is a common concept in the US, but for people who live outside the US, can you talk about what apartment locating or relocating is? Can you kind of share that, just a little bit of that process about what's involved in that?
Yeah, super simple business. Hypothetically, you're moving to Austin, Texas, and you're like, I need a place to live. You reach out to me. I help you find a place to live. And the apartment complex that you sign a lease with pays me a referral fee. That's it. It's that simple of a business. And I've been doing that for the last 6 years. It's a pretty simple business model.
Yeah. When you first started this, you went on this journey to understand survival and risk. Did you plan to write a book, or was it something that started off as journaling, and then a few months in, you're like, oh, I should do something with it? Or was it later on when you realized there might be some value for others here?
Mm-hmm. Once I started getting clients again, and I realized I was going to be more than just fine, I was like, oh, what's going on here? So I opened up just a simple Google Doc just to outline some ideas. And man, that was a domino.
Yeah.
And around the same time, there's a company called Scribe Media. They're still around. And they were offering these book writing lessons. I was just going through all of these ideas and outlines, and at the same time going through this book writing program. I'm like, I'll do a book. I have nothing else to do. I got plenty of time on my hands. I'm locked down. So most of my days are doing a little bit of business. I mean, by that point, my business was so streamlined, and it still is, that it requires very little input for pretty high output. Great. So I had all this time to just write and walk around my neighborhood and just let my mind kind of go wild and explore in the way it does when you're just wandering aimlessly. And a few months into this process, I'm like, yeah, I'll write a book. Sure, I'm a 3-year-old entrepreneur, but sure, I'll write a business book. Why not? And that was in 2020. It's 2023, almost 2024. So it's been that long of a journey. Yeah, once I started to write a book, I'm like, of course I'm going to do this. Because it was the first time in my life where I felt total connection to something. And I was going to do whatever I had to do to bring this thing to life. So I did it.
Yeah, amazing. It's interesting too that you talk about with your father being an attorney and your mom being a domestic engineer, especially in a Hispanic family, especially if you're Cuban and they've come to the States and they've made it. There's so much pressure in that family environment and family dynamic to be this thing or to be that thing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people around the world really experience that very deeply, where they've chosen a path that it's not necessarily what their parents would have chosen for them. And it's tough in those first few years. Well, probably the first 10 years or so, until you get to the point where you do have that autonomy and you've kind of made it. And a lot of times you don't really feel like you've made it until you look back and realize that okay, yeah, I can take care of myself here.
Yeah. I saw my dad in his law career, and he had his own business. And just seeing the law profession, like, I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. Because I saw the darkness. Mm-hmm. And in a different way, I did follow my dad's path, because my dad and I are very similar in the sense that we have to do things our way. Mm. He's a rebel. All my family were rebels in effect. And for me to go down my own path the way I've done it is very much me following in my dad's footsteps, but with a curvier path, if you will.
Yeah. More colorful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, more bumps along the road.
Yeah. So Alexander, let's talk about some of the terms that you use in the book. Again, international audience, we all kind of interpret things in different ways. And I think that the way that you've interpreted words and framed them is really empowering for us. So first of all, can you talk about survival? You use that, obviously, it's the first word of the book. What is survival to you, and why is it a choice?
Yeah, survival. No one forces us to be entrepreneurs. No one is forcing you to do this podcast. And survival is just simply a choice to continue on. And Risk, the main character of this book, is broadly about what makes you not want to make that decision. And that includes, in my world, 3 elements. Money, because even if we were charities or nonprofits, we would still need to make money to power the thing. Then we need time. You can't make money if you don't have time to make money. And as a human, you want time to live your life and just spend time with who you want to spend time with. But most importantly, it's energy. Because you can have time and money, but if you don't have the energy to actually turn it into a business, then nothing happens. So what is that energy? There's rational energy. If you're at like a cocktail party and someone asks, why do you do the thing? You tell them or whatever answer. Maybe it's the mission. Maybe it's because you just want to make money. But really the energy is emotional. Because hypothetically, like with you, if doing this podcast made you miserable, would you do it? Probably not. Same thing with your business. Say your business makes a lot of money, you still have time, but it makes you miserable. and you just feel awful doing it, then you're probably going to not want to do it. So that's a major shift in the framing of risk, because most of how risk has been framed has been in a very rationalist, formulaic, business school kind of way that shows up on spreadsheets and that could be crunched into formulas and outputs and all that stuff. And that can be useful, but for us normal people, risk is largely about the emotional damage we incur along the way. It's just a more human way of seeing business. We're not these monolithic corporations that operate on pure ration, but we're humans with complex psychic landscapes and emotions. And if that energy is gone, then everything is gone.
It's so interesting. I often think of energy as it's something that we're exchanging one thing for the other. And I think it's so interesting to think of energy as the emotional side of risk, or the aspect of risk, because it's so true. We can talk about risk in terms of numbers, but it doesn't mean anything. It's really about how it makes us feel and what we want to avoid, what we want more of and what we want less of.
Yeah. Sure. And it's the flip side, because we're not here merely to survive. Mm-hmm. We're not here just to think about risk. Because if you only think about risk, you're going to drive yourself crazy and paranoid, and it sucks. What I realize, it's a very simple inversion. If you take risk, which I just identify as potential bad stuff, and you flip it, turn it into potential good stuff, that's opportunity. And that right there is the tension that we're all dealing with as entrepreneurs. We're dealing with the reality that most of us don't make it. And there's a lot of bad stuff that can go wrong. But how do we consciously build a relationship to that, while at the same time getting to experience the upsides, whether that's freedom or money or meaning or mission, whatever that is? How do you survive so you can get all the good stuff? So it's about holding that tension together and not going crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, because it's such an extreme. And you talk about this in the book, how it can either one taken to the extreme. Either way, the pendulum is not healthy when it's at either end.
Mm-hmm. That's why I say darkness and light are both blinding.
Yeah.
Because people can be blinded by pessimism and paranoia, but people can also be blinded by too much optimism and too much positive thinking. Because if you're not willing to challenge yourself, then you're going to fall into one of those traps. So reality is in the middle.
In the book, you line out a formula that I think is ingenious. It's practical and it's tangible. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So despite having just, I think, dismantled why I don't like formulas, I made up my own.
It's different when it's your own.
Right. Yeah, my formula is great. But the main difference is my formula isn't a numbers formula. It's not something you plug in data sets into to pop out some number to make decisions. This is a Socratic question-based formula. And a question-based formula is useful because questions are eternal. The right questions in the right frames are something you could iterate on over and over and over because they never go bad. So I call it the RD risk formula, where risk equals damage times existence times exposure. That puts risk into these variables of damage. What's the bad thing that can happen? And what are the consequences of that thing happening? Existence is, does the risk exist or not? And exposure is, how likely is that thing to happen? And the entire book is designed in that framework of looking at risk from those three variables.
Can you give us an example? I know there are a lot in the book. Is there one that kind of comes to your mind? I'm sure that you've thought about so many. Is there one that comes to your mind?
I like to use the non-businessy way.
Yes, let's do that. I love non-businessy. Yes.
Yeah. So I have this bowl of lunch that was in front of me, some beef and rice. And there's a risk that the bowl falls off the table. And the damage in this case won't be that high because it's an empty bowl and it's a wood floor. So nothing really bad's going to happen. But say there was food in the bowl and say it's like a crystal bowl. So it falls and there's food everywhere and I get little splinters of crystal in my foot. Then the damage is very high. Then there's existence. Does the risk exist or not? And in this case, the risk that the bowl falls off the table exists because there's a bowl on the table. But if I just took the bowl off the table, then there would be no risk of it falling off. And then there's exposure, which is like the proximity metric or the probability metric. In this case, the closer the bowl is to the edge of the table, the more likely it will fall off. And the further away from the edge, the less likely it will fall off. So that's the way I present it in the book. But there's so many ways it manifests in business, from our business models to marketing to operations. There's so much.
Yeah. And I want to come back to risk, but while we're here talking about the formula, you also offer a formula for opportunity as well. Can you share that?
Yeah. So it's the same thing. You just change the damage portion to upside, and then you have opportunity equals upside times existence times exposure. So an opportunity could be to hire a new assistant, where the upside can be, say, freeing up 10 extra hours a week of work you don't like doing. And that could mean more time that you could spend with your family, more time for you to go to the gym. And all these upsides are just freeing up your time. Existence. Does the risk exist to hire an assistant? Yes, there's plenty of assistants out there. Exposure. Now is easier than ever. You can go on Upwork and find a bajillion assistants who want to work for you for a pretty reasonable rate. So that's why in my case, I have 4 assistants, because the upside is so high and the cost is so low.
That makes complete sense. And especially when we look at it, if it's something, some of you are audio learners, so you're hearing this, you're getting this as you're hearing it, but some of you are visual. So I encourage you to write those words out sometime. So again, the formula is risk equals damage times existence times exposure. And the formula for opportunity is opportunity equals upside potential or upside times existence times exposure. And as you go through those, I encourage you to go through one of these, maybe start with something like Alexander did, with something that's non-business, but then also try it with business. I used it and it's been amazing. I think too, Alexander talks, something that's so helpful is the way that you frame it. Risk is focused on what if it goes bad. Opportunity is what if it goes right. And that's kind of as simple as you can break it down. And it's so easy to focus on what can go wrong, but it's amazing when you focus on what can go right.
And so much of what we're doing is operating under maximum uncertainty. And ultimately what we're doing is trying to make decisions where the bad side is survivable, but the upside is really high. So we're looking for that asymmetry. And then how do you make asymmetrically positive decisions under uncertainty is the mind game that we're all playing here.
You talk about choosing risk and designing risk. And I think these words are so much better but I can't explain it. Why are these words better than the words that we typically link to risk that, like eliminating risk, managing risk, mitigating risk, taking risk?
Yeah.
Why do the words choosing and designing risk feel and seem so much better?
I spend a lot of time rebuilding the vocabulary we use around risk because words are so important. Words create the frames we use to organize reality. And what happens if we have good frames, we're able to make better decisions, and better decisions become better businesses. Same thing with the inverse. Bad words become bad frames, become bad businesses, become dead businesses. So in the case of default words and phrases like risk management, I realized that was kind of a silly way of thinking about it, because most of our reality isn't a function of actively managing risk in the same way somebody manages a restaurant. The reality and the way I phrase it, it's risk is a passive consequence of design in the same way the house I'm in is a passive consequence of design. So whoever built my house chose the right floor plans and foundation and materials, because if they didn't, then I'm going to have a serious problem. And same thing with like a TV or a car. The reason these things work is they were designed to work. And design is a network of choices. In your business, the risks and opportunities that you have are consequences of decisions you made when you were building the business, what the industry you went into, whether you took investors or not, whether you chose to have business partners, whether you chose to operate in this market or that market, where you chose to market, how you chose to differentiate yourself. These are all choices we make with different sets of upsides and downsides. So that's why my frame is choosing risk or designing risk.
Oh, that makes complete sense. The concept of the house, that's especially powerful. It's built by design, and you're not just assuming that the wall's going to fall. You're assuming it's going to stand, and
Right.
So what are your tips for designing risk for entrepreneurs?
My favorite one is simplicity.
I love that. Yes.
So there's Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong. That's like the super pessimistic law. But like the inverse is also true. Like what can't go wrong won't go wrong. In the case of my bowl of lunch food, if I just take it off the table, there's no risk of it falling anymore. So in that case, you are eliminating risk. But in business, most of us are small entrepreneurs, independent or small teams, and we can't afford complexity in the same way big businesses can. That's how a lot of us burn out, overwhelm ourselves, and just drive ourselves crazy because we're trying to do too much. And simplicity just means reducing the surface area of disaster. One of the biggest reasons my business is as healthy as it is because it's simple. I have one service that I operationalized and do it over and over and over, and it's easy. And there's so many ways you could simplify a business. You could simplify the business model, the marketing strategy. For a lot of people, especially service-based people, it's simplifying your offering, which means being very deliberate about what you don't offer, as with what you do offer. It could be simplifying your operations, the technology that you use, because the less things that can go wrong, the less things that will go wrong.
And I can see how that plays out throughout, even for businesses that have multiple revenue streams, because that is something that some people are sort of wired for. even if you have revenue coming in from different sources, there are so many ways that you can simplify. It's the little things. I say it's the 1,000 little things, not the one big things that makes the difference. And I can see how simplifying everything as much as you can, it really does help you design. Yeah, it does feel better.
Yeah,
it does. So I'm going to speak to the listeners for a second, Alexander, and give them some color. And then I'm going to ask you the next question. So for the listeners, Alexander's book is so well written. It's easy to read and it's easy to understand. It's not something that, you could just buzz through it, but he gives you a lot of opportunities to ask yourselves questions. And I would encourage you to read it and ask yourself those questions and spend some time journaling to write out those answers. So it might not be something that you don't read this book in a weekend, but you read it in chunks and really go through it and ask the questions. In the book, you're going to see that he gives really solid explanations of the risk renaissance, some of the things that he's talked about already, but he also gets into practical detail and practical examples about external risks and opportunities, those things you don't control. Internal risks and opportunities, those things that you do control inside your business, and the ultimate risk and opportunity, you as the entrepreneur. So while we don't have time to cover all these today, I'd love for Alexander to give some additional insight on one of the internal risks and one of the ultimate risks. So one of the internal risks, Alexander, that you talk about is competitive risk. What is your take on the concept of competition? Is it even a real thing?
No, competition is not real.
Okay.
I'll just drop that. And it's just the wrong word, because competition is like chess. We're playing the same game directly against each other, and whoever wins the game wins a trophy or whatever the prize is. And that is never, ever, ever the case in business. You're never competing directly against another business, because the trophy is a human who makes decisions, and that human gets to decide to pick you or another business. In this case of this podcast, you have, the listener, have the choice to listen to this podcast or listen to another podcast. And the risk to this podcast is that you choose something else. Maybe you don't even listen to another podcast. You just do something else with your time. So that creates a different frame where we're not playing the same game against each other. We're all playing different games next to each other. Mm-hmm. And the risk isn't competitive risk, it's replacement risk. And that puts us on a spectrum of how replaceable are we. The more you can be replaced, the more like a commodity you are, where the only thing that differentiates you is price. And when you're a commodity, you're already dead, because you don't control your business anymore. The market does, because the market controls pricing. And that's the mistake that I'll say most businesses make, is because they're thinking like competitors, they're copycatting everyone else around them. In my industry, real estate, you can just think of a real estate agent in your mind's eye. That's 99% of real estate agents, and they all fit in, and they all struggle to stand. They all struggle to stand out. That's why most of them don't make it. That's also why I have a taco-themed real estate company, because I stand out. No one is doing that. So on the other side, something that's irreplaceable is a monopoly. A monopoly is something that you have to have, or that cannot be replaced. And the questions to ask to become a monopoly are, what can you do, or what will you do that nobody else will do in ways your customers or clients care about? And all of us have one built-in monopoly, which is our reputations. Our reputations can't be copied or taken away from us. And that's our relationship to our customers and clients and the people we do business with. So that's why reputation is so important, because that is something that makes you stand out. And the stronger your reputation is, the less you will be replaced. And that's the path to immortality, in effect.
I think that is so freeing, probably for a lot of people. One of the things I talk about is that, especially in social entrepreneurship, we're all tackling such huge issues that, to me, there doesn't feel like there's a lot of competition. But I think what's gotten me to that point is that I know my lane. I know what I am good at. I know what I'm terrible at. I know what other people are really good at. And whenever you get to that point where you just, and it's what you said, it's what, might not get it all right, but what can you do, or what are you willing to do that others won't, that your customers will really appreciate and really want? I think that when you focus on that, the competition is such a low vibe thing. But the idea of someone, choosing or being replaced, it just has a totally different vibe. And it puts us in the driver's seat because, as you say, it's our reputation. That's our ultimate asset.
And I think it's also one of the most optimistic frames possible in entrepreneurship, because what that means is that survival is about being yourself and bringing the whole human version of you to the table. And that's the biggest advantage that we have as small entrepreneurs, is that we can be human in the ways that like Amazon or Google can't. And the way I show up in my business is just who I am, rather than me trying to copycat everyone around me. And it just feels better.
Yeah, it does.
I'd like that I can just show up in the way that I want to show up, be who I am, and it works.
You have a lot more energy at the end of the day when you're not trying to be somebody else or something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
So along that line, if we're talking about kind of on the subject of energy and being ourselves, one of the risks that you talk about, the ultimate risk that's within the entrepreneur, is burnout, the ultimate risk of burnout. I'm curious, especially from your experience and from so many of the businesses that you've studied and the entrepreneurs that you know, why is burnout so common?
Yeah. So the first kind of default answer that everyone tends to point to is quote unquote hustle culture. People use grind and grit and all these words where you have to work so hard to get all the success. And that's an easy scapegoat, and it's part of the truth, especially in the US. But I think the way it really manifests, because it's such a common word and concept that we're all familiar with, but why do we still fall into the trap? And I think it's when we stop treating ourselves like humans and treat ourselves like businesses instead. So when you're doing your expense reports and your taxes, you're looking at the revenue and all the expenses, you don't show up in the expense report. The time you spend in your business, the emotions you feel, doesn't show up. So you don't track those expenses because they're not monetary expenses. So that's why a lot of us spend a lot of time, too much time, on our businesses. That's why we incur so much emotional damage, because we're not thinking about it like an expense. But we have to, because like we said before, if you have no emotional energy left, then everything falls apart. Then there's the kind of burnout that most people think of. I call it the fast burn, where you work a ton of hours in a short period of time. And that's like the kind of the obvious burnout, but it's also like an obvious solution is just kind of take the pedal off, you relax, you kind of have return to like normal-ish work schedule, and then you recover. You're fine. Great. But I think the more interesting one is the slow burn. Mm-hmm. And it's more like just jogging. It's like the ultra marathon where you're just jogging and jogging and jogging, kind of doing like the same thing over and over and over again. And then slowly in the background, your energy is just slowly going away, and you don't really notice it. It's that frog boiling in water thing. It just happens slowly, and you don't realize it. But what you do realize is the wins stop feeling like wins, but the losses feel as bad as ever. And then you're like, what am I doing? And it happens over like years. And that's what happened to me with my business. It's not hard. I don't work more than 20 hours a week. But after years of doing the same thing over and over and over again, I'm like, what am I doing? I'm like tired of this. And I still haven't fully solved that. But I think it's important to recognize that there's nuance in burnout.
It's so interesting what you shared about, and I can see it. Ourselves we're not a line item on our budget, on our spreadsheet. And it's almost like we need to be. I don't know how that works.
Yeah.
But it's almost like we need to be. Kind of along that line, one of the things you talk about is having a relationship with your business as an entrepreneur. So why is that so important for entrepreneurs to invest time thinking about their relationship with their business?
Yeah, I think that's the most important risk for all of us to think about. Because that part of the book, Ultimate Risk, you are the biggest risk to your business. But the inverse is also true. Your business is the biggest risk to you, the entrepreneur. So I call that relationship risk. And all a relationship is an exchange of energy. And I think there's only one metric in business, that's return on energy. A positive relationship is a positive return on energy. A negative relationship is a negative return on energy. If I just suspect there's a big unspoken problem in the world of entrepreneurs, is I bet there's a lot of entrepreneurs that actually hate their businesses and they don't know what to do about it. And they think that they have to just grind and grit their way through a bad relationship and never quit, never give up, blah, blah, blah. But we don't say that with like human relationships. Like if you see someone, or if you're in a bad relationship with someone, you're like, this is not the relationship for me. I need to end this. People are like, congratulations, you ended a bad relationship, so you can move on to find a better one. Same thing with business. And I think just framing it as a relationship is so powerful because there's already a giant thought ecosystem around relationships that we can just use and apply it to a slightly different frame, but it like 99% holds up as the same exact problem. And there's three relationship types that I focus on. One is the hyper obsessive, you must work 1 million hours a day to be successful. The kind of people where they are their businesses and their businesses are them, and there's no separation. And it becomes this overwhelming, all-consuming relationship. We're like, great, your business is successful, but you're single and no one talks to you. And you have no good relationships. Well, I don't want that. Then there's the toxic relationship. I hate my business, but I need it. That sucks. But with those first two relationships, they obviously suck. And because they're obvious, they're addressable. The most dangerous relationship, I think, is the boring one. It's that 7 out of 10 relationship that's not bad enough to end, but it's not good enough to really light your fire.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one that coasts on for way longer than it should.
Mm-hmm.
And the final irony of this book is maybe you should end your business. And the quote that I like is from this guy, Neil Strauss. It's a failed relationship is not one that ends, but one that lasts longer than it should.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, maybe your business should die if that means you, the entrepreneur, can live.
Alexander, this is incredible. So to all the listeners, what you've heard is just scratching the surface. This is, I'm not a super fan of business books. I make no mistake about that. I don't like reading business books. This book from Alexander is so practical and so tangible. And he has asked himself these difficult questions. So it's not like he's on kind of on this pedestal looking down at all of us saying that we should ask ourselves these questions. He has done the hard work for himself and has come out the other side stronger. And he's shown us a way that we can be stronger for ourselves personally and professionally. And yes, sometimes the business does have to die for us to live. I've experienced that myself. So, Alexander, I'm going to ask you one more question. But before I get to that, considering the timeline and publishing, what is the estimated month and year that your book should be published or is supposed to be published? I know timelines change.
Yeah. So February 2024 is the target. And part of what I'm doing is scratching my own itch and publishing a long and detailed series about the making of this book.
Okay.
I'm publishing that at survivalfirstbook.com, which is where I'm going to be announcing things. But yeah, if you're interested in just what it's like to, in my case, self-publish a book, why I did it, the publishing strategy, the book cover design, every layer of a book making process, I'm laying down all of it. So for all the creators in the audience, it's a really good resource.
That's fantastic. So we'll put that survivalfirst.com. I'm going to put that in the show notes so everyone can go to that. I would say that's probably the best source to sign up there, because then you get all the behind the scenes and you'll be the first to know. This episode is estimated to air in April 2024. So the book may be out, but if for whatever reason it gets pushed out, if you're on the website, you'll be able to know when it's going to be out and how to find it. So Alexander, what is your biggest vision for Survival First in terms of impact for the entrepreneurial landscape?
I wrote this book for my entrepreneur friends because I want them to survive the same way I want myself to survive. And I think the big mindset shift is to not ignore risk, but to dance with it, to see it, to build a better relationship with it, so we can make better decisions, so we can treat ourselves as humans who own businesses rather than entrepreneurs or however else we want to see ourselves, but to see ourselves as humans first. And as for myself, I don't know. I was talking to my dad this morning. I told him that this book is my flaming lance into destiny's abyss.
That's beautiful.
And drinking my own Kool-Aid, this is a choice that I think will give me asymmetric upside and survivable downside. So yeah, we'll see what reality has to offer after this thing goes live. Well,
one of the things I think you start off the book you say to the rebel creator and entrepreneur reading this, thank you for betting on yourself. So Alexander, I thank you for encouraging us to bet on ourselves, because it's so easy to look outside when 99% of the time the answer is within. So Thank you for your encouragement and for cheering us on. And thank you for your authenticity and your rawness in your creation and your delivery of the book. And I look forward to its success for many years to come.
Thank you.